What's up everybody, welcome back to Mickwit Crafts, and today we're going to be remaking a diorama that I had previously completed for one of my players that didn't really go as planned. The story revolves around Slate Stonebreaker, a dwarven archaeologist who was rescued from a cave collapse and flood from an elemental earth genie known as a Dao. For starters, I wanted to try and reuse the miniatures and lights from the previous build, so the first step is to carefully remove the miniatures and lights so that they're still functional. Now, it may seem like I'm just hacking and pulling foam pieces out as needed rather than using any real precision. And yeah. Slate was on an expedition in the Shattered Isles when what felt like a massive earthquake opened the walls of the cave he was in. The falling debris had not only injured Slate, shattering multiple limbs, but the water pouring in was quickly coming to claim him. Feeling as though the gods had finally punched his ticket, Slate had almost given up when a small golden light flickered in front of him. Once I'd extracted the miniatures, it was time to start building our new base. I started by measuring out a 4x4 inch square on my foam board, cutting it out, and then cleaning up the edges to get a nice smooth surface. Then I pulled out my bag of foam bits to begin piecing together my collapsed cave. I wanted to make sure I left space for a centerpiece statue that I had decided to use, so I built up the rubble around the edges to give a nice open seating in the middle for the statue. Slate peered closer to the glimmering light and found a small golden lamp. Almost absent-mindedly wiping away the dirt, an explosion of white light emerged from the vessel. Slate covered his eyes from the brightness, and when he looked again, he saw the shining figure of the Dao Perseus floating in front of him. Once the base was built, I mixed up some terrain paste using plaster and Mod Podge and applied it with a gloved hand, and secured my statue in the center of the base before giving the whole thing a coat of black primer. I then mixed up a dark gray wash to begin painting the rocks. I did 3 layers of the wash with progressively lighter shades near the top to give the effect of the light drowning out near the bottom of the cave. Perseus informed Slate that while their crossing paths may have been luck, she could offer him something greater than his old life as an explorer and an archaeologist. A shift was occurring within the natural order, and if the mortal world was going to survive, it needed those willing to journey to the darkest recesses of humanity to save it. Once the washes were complete, it was time to do every painter's favorite cheat technique, dry brushing. I went another shade lighter than my last wash and then proceeded to rather heavy-handedly brush all of the rock surfaces. The thin amount of paint allows for it to just hit on the raised areas, keeping the more recessed bits of the stone much darker. Once the painting was done, it was time to start adding in the nature bits. I dabbed on some gloss Mod Podge with a sponge and piece by piece began adding in some crumbling rocks, a bit of white lichen, and finally some moss buildup to bring the whole thing together. I wanted to make sure everything looked old enough that it would make sense for an archaeologist to, actually be down here exploring it. She offered Slate the chance to be one of those saviors. She would rescue him from his watery grave and empower him to be a champion of Sindarin, but she would need his loyalty in return, as well as a promise not to hesitate when the time came to face what was coming. Slate, seeing very few options, accepted the pact, and with a flash of light, found himself lying in an open field. Broken, battered, but alive. With the base complete, I drilled the hole for my lights and then used a brass tube to guide the wires through the base. From there, I carved out a space in the base to hold battery housing and excess wiring. Then with the lights run, I secured our genie and Slate to the base before moving on to the really nerve-wracking part. I decided I wanted to do a 6-inch deep resin pour for this diorama, which of course requires a dam, so the next step is to score out sheets of safety glass to use for the dam. With the safety glass measured out, it was time to build the dam. I started by securing the foam base to a sheet of safety glass for the base of the dam. I decided to use UV resin, curing it a bit before adding the walls and then finishing the curing process with the walls secured. Once all the walls were up, I ran a bead of clear silicone caulk along all of my seams and gave the seams 24 hours to cure before doing the water test. Once that was done, it was time to mix and pour our resin. The deep pour resin I use is a 2-to-1 ratio formula, and after learning the hard way about my improper measurements, I made sure that this mixture was extremely precise, despite how it may look in the video. Then I added in a few drops of turquoise pigment to give this resin a nice murky water coloring, and after mixing thoroughly, I poured the resin and then spent about an hour hitting all of the bubbles with a butane torch as they rose to the top. Usually the resin only takes 72 hours to cure, but just to be safe, I decided to give it 4 days, and I have to say that while it's not perfect, I'm glad I did. Nothing is more disheartening than waiting half a week only for you to realize that your pour has been a failure. Next, it was time to remove our safety glass and clean up the pour. Luckily, the safety glass came off relatively easily, though some bits were a bit more stubborn. But once the dam was off and the majority of excess resin removed, I pulled out my craft knife to carve some of the softer edges off and remove some of the raised points. Some of the resin had also leaked underneath the base, so I had to cut the resin free from the bottom to access the wires for the lights. Then it was time to put on our respirator and start sanding. I started with a coarse 150 grit sandpaper to level out the top of the build, as well as all the sharp corners around the edges, and then once everything was level, I began to gradually increase the grit level from 150 step by step all the way up to 4000 to give it a nice glass finish. When going into finer grit levels, it's important to add water to the surface being sanded. This helps prevent overheating and damaging the surface, while also helping to smooth the whole thing out. Once all of the edges were sanded, I used a Q-tip to remove the resin dust from the open bubble holes, and then gave all of my surface a hand polish with a chamois cloth. I use Meguiar's plastic polish, but there are plenty of polishes to choose from, so it really is just your preference. After the polish, I gave the whole thing a coat of acrylic clear coat before soldering our lights back together, and after securing the battery housing and a quick light test, it was time for glamour shots. Thank you so much to everyone for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss any of my future builds. This video actually marks the end of my D&D character backstory series, so I'm going to start working on a few different ideas that I've had flying around for a while involving various nerd properties. But that doesn't mean we won't be revisiting any of these characters to display any of their antics or achievements in the future. We are also very quickly moving down the road to 500 subscribers, so a thank you to each and every one of you that has been watching. I, again, cannot thank you enough, and please be sure to share this with anybody that you think might be interested. Other than that, I hope you've enjoyed this video, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next one.